A low, unsettling hum drifted across the still surface of the lake, one of those sounds that seemed to rise from nowhere yet pressed against everything. It pulsed through the pre-dawn mist, vibrating across the wooden planks of the dock, creeping into the walls of the old cabin perched above the shoreline. The world looked frozen in a bluish gloom, like the night had refused to release its hold. The cabin stood as the only solid shape in an ocean of fog, its silhouette stretched tall and shadowy as though guarding something unspoken inside. The forest behind it breathed slowly, branches shifting with an eerie rhythm as if echoing the same humming vibration rolling over the lake. It wasn't a peaceful sound, it was the kind that made the air thicken, the kind that warned anyone listening that the day ahead would not unfold gently. A cold wind threaded through the pine needles and rattled loose twigs across the ground, each movement punctuating the uneasy melody floating in the darkness. From the outside, the cabin appeared old, forgotten, and lonely, the type of structure anyone would assume belonged to a man who wanted to disappear for a while. Its weathered logs carried scars from storms, seasons, and a lifetime of secrets. But inside, beneath that creaking roof and behind the fogged windows, something far more significant than a quiet morning was taking shape. The kind of moment that could split a life into before and after. While the lake remained still, a faint movement disturbed the silence, footsteps crunching lightly over frosted gravel. They carried a kind of impatience, an energy too sharp for the tranquility surrounding the cabin. The humming intensified, like the world itself sensed the shift approaching. Soon, the outline of a figure emerged from the thick veil of trees, moving slowly but with a familiar arrogance woven into each step. The fog curled around the figure as though reluctant to let it pass, blurring the edges, making the form appear ghost-like. Closer and closer it advanced, unwavering, drawn not by accident but by entitlement. A shape framed by indignation rather than purpose. Even through the mist, the stiffness in posture hinted at the type of presence that brought conflict wherever it traveled. The type that believed rules bent only for others. The type that saw boundaries as suggestions and respect as optional. The cabin sensed it, or at least it felt as if it did. The humming deepened, echoing across the lake in a way that seemed almost sentient, like the environment itself braced for impact. The unpredictable morning tightened around the moment, ready to break. As the figure stepped onto the edge of the property, the silence fractured in a way that felt almost prophetic. What was about to happen inside that cabin would upend everything: identities, assumptions, consequences. And before long, the world would learn a truth the intruder never imagined possible. Because inside that quiet, isolated cabin, the person waiting was not just another weekend visitor. Not just another homeowner minding their business. And not someone who tolerated trespassing without reason. Inside, framed by the dim morning light and surrounded by the weight of official documents, sat a figure whose very presence could shatter a life built on arrogance. And the intruder was seconds away from walking straight into the one cabin they should have never touched. Hit subscribe, watch till the end. The lake had always been a sanctuary, a place carved out of childhood memories and quiet escapes, generations passing down its stories like treasured heirlooms. For the main character, it wasn't just a vacation spot. It was a reminder of lineage, resilience, and the long history of a family that had fought too hard for far too long to keep a piece of land that belonged to them. Long before expensive cabins replaced simple wooden shacks, long before wealthy outsiders claimed the area as a private escape, the lake had been a home wrapped in peace. But peace never lasted long for someone like him. He had arrived at the cabin the night before, long after the sun had dipped below the line where water kissed sky. The drive had been long, the kind that made the mind unravel memories without permission. As he entered the clearing where the cabin stood, the past came rushing back. The sound of his grandfather's footsteps on the porch, the smell of firewood, the way the lake looked when the moon rested on its surface like a silver coin. These were memories untouched by the ugliness of the world, memories that reminded him of better days. This trip wasn't for leisure. It wasn't even planned. It was a breath he desperately needed, a moment away from the weight of his work, a role that demanded composure, fairness, and constant vigilance. Being the state attorney general meant carrying the stories of thousands, But the stories that haunted him the most were always the ones rooted in discrimination, land disputes, and unequal power. People often assumed authority made the world easier to navigate, yet all it ever did was expose him more deeply to the fractures in justice. Returning to the lake felt like stepping into a space where answers might finally come. The cabin was a grounding point, a reminder of the strength his family had instilled in him. It was the place where he first learned that silence could carry wisdom, that solitude could sharpen truth, and that land could hold memories like veins held blood. He intended to spend the weekend reviewing confidential case files, documents tied to an investigation that had grown increasingly disturbing. Complaints of discrimination by a powerful homeowners association, allegations of intimidation, and reports of targeted harassment toward minority property owners. What began as mild concerns had escalated into something far more insidious. The more he read, the more the pattern became undeniable. There were names repeating across statements, names tied to aggressive encounters, property intrusions, and community discord. And one name appeared more than all the others, an individual known across the neighborhood for behavior masked as concern for community standards, but consistently wielded against only certain residents. The stories painted a clear pattern of selective enforcement, control, and quiet intimidation. He had not planned on meeting anyone that morning. The visit was meant to be low-key, quiet, unnoticed. The cabin was one of the few places where he could retreat without attracting attention. The foggy morning had wrapped the cabin in a gentle silence, and inside he had settled into his work, pages spread across a wide wooden table, warm lamplight illuminating the details. The case files with red markers, the confidential reports, the maps of land parcels, and the highlighting that traced systemic patterns of exclusion. The deeper he went into the documents, the clearer it became. Justice would require exposing more than individual wrongdoing. It would require revealing the unspoken culture embedded into the community. But while he worked, while he let the hum of the lake ease the tension in his shoulders, someone else had been watching the cabin. The intruder, an HOA board member known for her overbearing presence, had a reputation for showing up unannounced, inspecting properties that were never hers, inserting herself into spaces she believed she had authority over. The cabin had long been a target of her scrutiny. Every time a person of color visited the lake, she found a reason to make her presence known. She carried herself as though chosen by the land itself to guard it, as though her lineage granted her exclusive rights to the lake's serenity. She had seen a vehicle parked by the cabin that morning. She had seen the lights flicker through the window. And in her mind, that was enough justification to act. She believed the authority she imagined she possessed extended into private spaces. She believed the world around her belonged only to those she approved of. And so she marched toward the cabin with the certainty that she was correcting a wrong. Inside, the Attorney General remained unaware of the approaching steps. He continued reviewing the reports, tracing the timeline of events that would soon become the foundation of a legal reckoning. He paused as he read a particularly troubling portion of a complaint, one describing a racial slur painted across a homeowner's shed late one night. Another detailing a forced entry into a cabin owned by a black family, an incident ignored by local enforcement. These weren't isolated events. They formed a pattern that mirrored too many other communities across the country, quiet hostility disguised as neighborhood watchfulness. He leaned back, the weight of the cases pressing into his thoughts. The lake had been a refuge growing up, but seeing this place tangled in the same injustices he fought against daily was disheartening. The racism woven into the land, into the cabins, into the homeowners association, felt like history repeating itself. The idea that a sanctuary could become a battleground was something he could never fully accept. The air inside the cabin was heavy with contemplation. Dust particles drifted through the sunlight slicing through the windows, settling on old furniture that held generations of memories. The kettle on the stove offered a faint warmth, filling the space with a quiet comfort. Everything felt safe, still, untouched, an illusion that would soon shatter. He stood for a moment and walked toward the window, gazing out at the lake hidden under a thick sheet of fog. The humming sound from earlier still lingered, vibrating across the water like a low warning. He didn't know why it bothered him, but something about the morning felt charged, like the tranquility was just a thin veil stretched over something tense and unresolved. As he turned back toward his work, the intruder closed in. She stepped past the private property sign without hesitation, her expression sharpened by assumptions crafted over years of unchallenged authority. The frost beneath her shoes gave way with soft cracks, each one echoing through the muted stillness of the property. She scanned the cabin with the intensity of someone convinced they were uncovering wrongdoing. Inside, completely unaware of her presence, the Attorney General returned to reading. The page in his hand detailed a complaint involving the very woman now approaching his door, one describing harassment framed as compliance enforcement, targeting anyone who didn't fit her vision of acceptable community membership. He paused, absorbing the depth of the issue, unaware that the subject of that report was seconds away from forcing her way inside. Her steps grew louder, crunching through frosted gravel edging the cabin porch. She moved with a purpose born not from responsibility, but from entitlement. The fog curled around her shoulders as though trying to restrain her, but she continued forward with the confidence of someone who believed consequences didn't apply. In her mind, she was protecting the lake, protecting property values, protecting a lifestyle she believed was reserved only for those she deemed worthy. It never crossed her mind that she was the threat. As she reached the porch, the air shifted. The humming across the lake grew stronger, vibrating against the cabin walls. Inside, the Attorney General felt it, a subtle tremor that brushed against his awareness. He straightened, sensing something was off but unable to pinpoint what. He took a breath and returned his attention to the documents. Outside, the intruder lifted her hand, hesitated for a moment, then placed it on the handle of the cabin door. The thin line between suspicion and intrusion snapped in an instant. The world stood still. And without a single thought for who might be inside, or what consequences awaited, she pushed. The door crashed inward with a force that shattered the fragile calm of the morning. Cold air rushed into the cabin, swirling through papers, rattling the thin curtains, carrying with it the heavy scent of unwarranted intrusion. The Attorney General froze, the weight of the documents still in his hand as he turned toward the sudden breach. The figure standing in the doorway radiated indignation, her presence cutting through the room like a blade. She scanned the cabin with a rehearsed superiority, her posture stiff with self-appointed authority. Her eyes darted to every corner, sweeping across the walls, the furniture, the documents spread across the table, as though expecting to uncover something unlawful. But beneath her inspection lurked something far older than suspicion, a familiar edge. The kind of quiet hostility that had shadowed him in countless spaces throughout his life, camouflaged as concern, dressed in the uniform of neighborhood standards. The cabin, once a sanctuary, now felt contaminated by the very energy he had spent months investigating. The woman's intrusion echoed the complaints he had read only minutes before: forced entries, selective enforcement, the weaponization of rules against residents who didn't fit her narrow vision of belonging. Her presence inside his family cabin was no accident. It was the embodiment of entitlement, the living proof of every report lying on the table. Outside, the lake remained still as though holding its breath. The humming deepened, pulsing against the windows in a steady warning. Inside, the tension wrapped itself around the room, thick and suffocating. The Attorney General felt the moment settle like a storm cloud on the edge of breaking. The woman stood firm, convinced she was in the right. She had no idea whose space she had just violated. No idea what storm she had walked into. The realization struck her too late. An invisible shift in the room, a quiet authority radiating from the man she had barged in on. The documents scattered across the table were not casual papers but sealed files marked with the weight of government insignia, each one a silent indictment of the very behavior she had built her power upon. The cabin's stillness thickened, the walls seeming to close in as the truth pressed itself against her. He rose slowly, not with anger, but with a calm that held far more force. Every movement he made revealed the depth of his position, the unmistakable presence of someone accustomed to dismantling the systems that people like her hid behind. The fog outside withdrew from the windows as though the lake itself recognized the shift in control. The humming grew stronger, vibrating through the wooden floors, resonating like a warning drumbeat. Her confidence faltered. The entitlement that carried her through the door dissolved under the weight of who stood before her. The cabin became a courtroom, the air the verdict, the silence the evidence. She had crossed into a place she believed she owned, only to find herself standing before the one person in the state with the power to expose everything she'd tried to bury. The weight of the moment settled over the cabin like a slow-descending fog, heavy enough to press against the walls. She stood frozen, surrounded by evidence she never imagined would lead back to her. The lake outside grew eerily silent, as though nature itself paused to witness the unraveling of a long-ignored truth. The Attorney General's steady presence filled the room, a quiet force that dismantled every illusion of authority she had carried into the cabin. The reports on the table reflected years of unchecked behavior, patterns of targeted harassment, covert intimidation, and calculated intrusion masked as community service. Her forced entry had become the final thread in a tapestry of misconduct, the undeniable proof tying her actions to the broader system of discrimination infecting the lake community. The realization crept across her expression, her certainty dissolving into fear as she recognized the magnitude of her mistake. He gathered the documents with deliberate calm, each page a silent promise that justice was no longer a distant concept but an imminent reality. The lake, once clouded with mist, began to reveal its surface, the still water reflecting a slow, inevitable shift. Change had arrived, quiet, firm, and unstoppable. As he stepped past her and into the clearing outside the cabin, the air felt lighter, as though the land itself finally exhaled. She remained inside, surrounded by the consequences she had created, the cabin transforming into a mirror of everything she had tried to control. The world would soon learn what happened on that fog-covered morning. The community would face the truths it had buried, and the lake would no longer be a place where silence protected injustice. Because justice, once awakened, moves like water, quiet, steady, and impossible to stop. And those who cling to power built on prejudice eventually face the reflection they fear most.